In this video, I'm covering 5 draft lessons you can learn from Final Fantasy to help you out in future draft formats. First up, look out for easily poached archetypes. Now this will make more sense as I provide an example, which red-green is the perfect one from Final Fantasy. Some of its best cards, or theoretically the best cards for a red-green landfall aggro deck, would be Saz's Chocobo, which is a 1-drop that grows as you hit land drops, and Gladiolus Amicitia, which is a 6-drop that really cares about hitting land drops and also hits you a land drop when it comes into play, a great multicolored uncommon. Now the problem with these cards for red-green was that Saz's Chocobo was just so generically strong that it was good in any green deck, so you wouldn't just get it for your red-green decks. And even though Gladiolus was a multicolored card, because it was expensive and was a really strong effect, it would often get splashed by other green decks like black-green or blue-green, so your red-green deck wouldn't even get it late, which meant that you weren't going to be able to fully benefit from the power of the red-green landfall aggro deck because some of its best cards were either too generically good or we're going to be splashed by other decks, which is a problem. As a contrast, we can look at blue-white, which gets some really powerful cards like Valkyrie Aerial Unit or Titus Blitzball Star. Valkyrie Aerial Unit is not a card that other decks can really use because they don't have as many artifacts as blue-white, so you can get Valkyrie Aerial Unit incredibly late. Titus, it's a 3-drop, it's not as easy to splash. The other gold, the multicolored blue-white uncommon was similarly not a card you'd want to splash, and so blue-white got to benefit from the fact that it could get some of these cards later because other decks couldn't use them, which means that that archetype gets a little bit of a boost by having these more niche cards that fit into the deck, so if you're drafting it, you can get them later. So keep an eye out for those decks that are easily poached, and by contrast, the decks that are more niche, and you're going to be able to get these powerful cards for them late. Next, knowing a card's homes is key. This is kind of connected to that first point, but it also applies to individual cards. Cornered by Black Mages is one of the best examples of this because it's the sort of card where if you're an aggressive black deck, this card can absolutely punish your opponents. It comes down on turn 3, kills one of their creatures, and you have this pinger that's going to be really relevant to your game plan because every ping is going to count. In a more defensive black deck, however, you'd rather have something like a Shinra Reinforcements a lot of the time to fuel your graveyard synergies, gain you some life, and be a better blocker on the board, as well as the fact that the sacrifice effect of Cornered by Black Mages gets worse over the course of the game as more like 1/1 tokens find their way into play and things like that. And so knowing which home is good for a card is really important. And as just an example, so we're not just only looking at black cards there, Call the Mountain Chocobo is another great example where in a sort of red-white equipment aggro deck, it wasn't really going to shine because you wanted much better stats than a 4-mana 2/2 in that deck, and you didn't really care about hitting your land drops and getting into the super late game. Whereas in blue-red, where Call the Mountain Chocobo really shined, it was a great way to trigger your cards that cared about casting expensive spells multiple times. Hitting your land drops was good because you had card draw to refill your hand after you were hitting your land drops, and overall being able to trigger your stuff twice and just being a good non-creature spell that was still going to affect the board state was really nice for that deck. So it had certain homes where it was good, so instead of thinking of the card as generically good or generically bad, knowing where it was going to belong was really key for building good decks in this format and is going to be an essential skill continuing going forward. Next, smoothing can be better than it looks. The two cards that really come to mind for this principle is Resentful Revelation and Dreams of Laguna. Both of these cards looked like they were going to be somewhat filler level cards. They just give you a little thing to do early, give you something to do late, but they were both really, really strong because they helped you avoid both getting too few lands and also getting too many lands by giving you something to do on turn 2 to make sure you hit your land drops, find your colors, find the key cards you need to curve out, and then also in the late game giving you something to do with the flashback where you can then be like, okay, I've drawn a few too many lands, but I've got this extra resource in the graveyard that's going to get me more spells. And so both of these cards were way better than they looked, and so going forward, keeping an eye out for this sort of spell that can smooth your draws early and also late is going to be a nice thing to keep an eye out for. Next, a good stat line has changed. Now, there are cards like 4-mana 3/3 flyers that you just expect to perform reasonably well, and Rook Turret is the card that looked like it was going to be much better than it was. There are other examples from the set, but Rook Turret is a pretty nice example here because 4-mana for a 3/3 flyer used to just be a really rock-solid card. It attacks well in the air, it's got reasonable stats, so it can block 2-drops a lot of the time, but in an age where you're getting 2-drops like Sahagin or Scorpion Sentinel relatively consistently, so Sahagin is just like a growing 2-mana threat that can attack for 2 damage, 3 damage, 4 damage in the mid to late game. Scorpion Sentinel becomes a 2-mana 4/4. All of a sudden, a card like Rook Turret, which we were looking at, which is a 4-mana 3/3 flyer, is just, even with extra upside, not necessarily going to cut it. And so you have to keep in mind that a good stat line has changed, and just because a card's like, okay, it's a relatively big flyer for 4 mana, you just have to remember that we are getting much better cards at all mana costs, and so a good stat line has changed. And then the final principle for lessons moving forward is that new card types need careful evaluation. The saga creatures were a big deal in Final Fantasy, these summon creatures, and it was hard to properly value them going in. A lot of them were pretty be like, okay, they're going to eventually sacrifice themselves, so they aren't necessarily going to perform particularly well. But Summon Fat Chocobo ended up being a really strong one, even though a card like Summon GF ended up being pretty weak. And why would this be? Well, in retrospect, it's easy to realize that Summon Fat Chocobo being a 5-drop, having this big impact, having 4 chapters means a lot more, because 4 extra turns starting by the time you play your 5-drop is a much larger percentage of the remainder of the game, because oftentimes you play Summon Fat Chocobo and the game will end before the Chocobo has completely exhausted itself as a resource. Whereas if you play Summon GF Ifrit on turn 3, oftentimes your opponent can take a couple hits and then the GF Ifrit goes away. And so even just that simple understanding of, oh, the more expensive ones, they're going to be played out in the later stages of the game, which is closer to the end of the game, so they're going to be around for a larger portion of that. Also, the fact that the Chocobo attacks really well, being a 4/4 trampler, essentially, means your opponent is much more likely to have to deal with it compared to a 3/2 that doesn't have trample or something like that. The fact that you get to keep the bird token forever. I mean, these cards, these are the sorts of things that you could, there is definitely signs in place where you could think, okay, Summon Fat Chocobo is going to be good, GF Ifrit's not, but without actually playing with the cards, it was tricky. And so just getting more experience playing with these new card types, seeing what it's like to play with a resource that will eventually go away, gives some nice insights into how to evaluate these sorts of cards going forward. And also just is a note to be like, okay, not all the saga creatures are going to be bad just because they're sacrificing themselves. Just keep in mind every card individual basis, and then being really methodical with the evaluations of these new card types, because the saga creature was new, and now we have a little bit more insight into that, and it will also help with evaluating new card types going forward. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. If you made it to the end, leave hashtag future fantasy, because this is the lessons for the future from Final Fantasy. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.